If you know your history, you know that nationalism that has become extreme resulted in horrible things: the erosion of democracy and civil liberties, authoritarianism, and the death of millions. Today we often hear in the media of the possibility of right-wing nationalism returning and could be rising among religious individuals. The fear of Christian nationalism is on the rise, and many assume the best way to handle this is to reduce Christianity, or at least its hold over people. But does the research support this? You might be surprised to find out the best way to reduce Christian nationalism is to encourage more Christianity. Nationalism has often been defined in different ways. In a general sense, it can refer to mere patriotism and can mean to identify with one's own nation and support for its interests. Most people could be nationalist in this limited sense. But a more extreme version of nationalism is when one's individual loyalty and devotion to the nation-state surpasses other individual or group interests, and one thinks their nation is superior to all others in all ways. Extreme nationalism often results in authoritarianism, where a leading figure is needed to guide and direct the nation. Democratic rule becomes untrustworthy because traitors or outsiders could infiltrate through the government and weaken the nation. So nationalism has historically resulted in authoritarianism. Similarly, sometimes researchers talk about civilizationism, which is like nationalism, but one focuses on the whole of their civilization, like Western civilization. One views Western civilization as superior to all other civilizations, and that should be protected from outside intrusion and dominate all other cultures. Christian nationalism, or civilizationism, generally is understood to mean that Christian values and doctrines should have power over the state and culture. The nation and culture should be defined by aspects within Christianity, and the government should be active in enforcing this, through things like having Christian symbols in public spaces, laws based on values found in Christianity, or forcing children to pray in schools. Immigration is also discouraged, as one doesn't want outsiders to come in, bringing in their own cultural values and altering the Christian nation from within. To quote from one paper, Christian nationalism is described as a cultural framework concerned with national heritage, boundary drawing, social order, embattlement, and conquest. Christian nationalism does not necessarily mean the goal is evangelism, or developing Christian beliefs in individuals, or encouraging people to be more religious or devout. There are many individuals in research that are quite secular in their beliefs, but are still considered Christian nationalists. This is because it focuses more on how the nation or culture as a whole is presented. We should project that we are defined by Christian symbols and rituals. Christian nationalism may be politically salient outside of devout Christian circles, beyond the Christian traditions of its origin, and in a wide range of contexts. The assumption of many is that adherence to Christian nationalism is a result of more people affirming Christian religiosity. If we reduce the number of Christians in society, or reduce the hold Christianity has on people, Christian nationalism will decrease. But the research indicates the opposite is true. Recently, a study conducted in the US from 2021 found that among politically right individuals, Christian nationalism was found among those who were the least religious. To quote, "We find no evidence that Christian nationalism mobilized church-based support in the election. This is demonstrated by the fact that in our results, Christian nationalism is only strongly associated with Trump support for voters who do not attend religious service. Among religious attenders, the effect of Christian nationalism on Trump voting is not only weak, it is also not statistically different from zero. White nationalist groups in the United States explicitly use Christian nationalist rhetoric, but those who identify with such movements tend to not be strongly involved in mainstream Christian congregations." So according to the research, Christian nationalism is more of a politically motivating force for the unchurched, and it seems to thrive with secularism. Another study found that although populist radical right parties of Europe tend to advertise themselves as defending Christian identity and values, they are unlikely to attract religious Christian voters. Populist radical right parties take pains to show that they are defenders of Christian identity and values, and yet they do not widely attract religious Christian voters. Our analyses confirm that paradox, As religiosity increases, the odds of voting for a PRR party instead of a mainstream right party decline. Additionally, it was found that anti-religious sentiment has been found to be more distressing to individuals who do not attend regular church service. And unchurched Christian nationalists are more likely to favor an authoritarian figure using populist appeals. The Social Capital Community Benchmark Survey showed that the biggest gap in volunteering and charitable giving is between religious and secular conservatives. A conservative is more likely to volunteer at a charity if they are religious. And in Europe, Christian religiosity tends to aid in making one less likely to vote for a far radical right party. What researchers are indicating is as religious belief declines, for many especially on the right, it does not also erode the identity markers or cultural symbols of Christianity as well. Many still hold to their Christian heritage and make this an identity marker, but without the core doctrines and beliefs. So the symbols and identity markers of Christianity are often transferred onto national or cultural markers and often become more political in their understanding. Philip S. Gorski said, "Loose from its religious moorings, religious nationalism floats free from the ethical tether of Christian ethics and drifts even further in the direction of secular messianism." Roger Brubaker said, "It is precisely the ongoing erosion of Christianity as doctrine, organization, and ritual that makes it easy to invoke Christianity as a cultural and civilizational identity, characterized by punitively shared values that have little or nothing to do with religious belief and practice." This is backed by research on attitudes of immigration. Christian nationalists tend to favor less immigration and more restrictive measures. But a recent study found that the strongest anti-immigration attitudes are found among non-active Christians. The more religiously an active one is, the more Christian nationalism is magnified, and the more likely one is to align with anti-immigration sentiment. To quote, "Christian nationalism may be powerfully operative among religiously inactive Americans. This suggests that religious identities and beliefs appeal to many Americans for their political and cultural meaning, and not necessarily their traditional spiritual intent." In Europe, many on the political right tend to be more likely civilizationalists, in that they wish to defend Christian or Western civilization from immigrants that are suspected of infiltrating Europe to change it from its traditional Christian heritage. It is often assumed that Christianity motivates anti-immigration sentiment. However, Kenneth Vaughan conducted a study which looked at the acceptance of refugees at the individual level, regional level, and national level, and actually found at the individual level, Christians, with the exception of Catholic Christians, and the unaffiliated, are relatively similar in their policy preferences regarding the admittance of refugees. Religious service attendance is associated with more generous policy preferences. At the national and regional level, percent unaffiliated is associated with more restrictive preferences. Additionally, greater religiosity was linked to support for inclusive immigration policy. A 2017 study looked directly at anti-Muslim sentiment in Western Europe from before the immigration crisis, and found that, although more secularized countries are on average more tolerant towards Muslims and Islam, strongest anti-Muslim attitudes are nonetheless found among the non-religious in these countries. Roger Brubaker notes that what seems to happen is as Europe secularizes, and as religious beliefs and involvement decline, Christian symbols and identity markers are redefined in religio-civilizational terms, and this civilization must be protected from outside intrusion. Secularism is redefined as an ideology of the right, and the right is also appropriating liberal themes like gender equality and tolerance of homosexuality. The most secularized region of the world is being characterized in religio-civilizational terms. Christianity is redefined as a matrix of liberalism, secularity, gender equality, and gay rights. Additionally, research indicates Christianity, and specifically Protestant Christianity, leads to more civil liberties, education, literacy, and democracy, and does not lead to more authoritarianism or extreme nationalism. If you want to reduce nationalism and authoritarianism, you should encourage more Christianity. You should encourage people to attend church and become more religious. It has been shown that historically, Protestants were catalysts for increasing literacy and education and spreading democracy around the world. Robert Woodbury says, "Conversionary Protestants were a crucial catalyst initiating the development and spread of religious liberty, mass education, mass printing, newspapers, voluntary organizations, most major colonial reforms, and the codification of legal protections for non-whites in the 19th and early 20th centuries." If the Christian worldview led to authoritarianism and extreme nationalism, we wouldn't expect to see democratic institutions, a focus on education, and civil liberties to come out of Christian societies. But historically, the opposite seems to have occurred, supporting the point Christianity does not lead to authoritarian ideologies. Woodbury notes the historical evidence indicates many Protestants helped people around the world fight for civil liberties and anti-colonial measures, like transferring power away from the British to indigenous people. Missionaries found that colonial abusers made mission work extremely hard, so in order to win more converts, missionaries often fought against abusers. Missionary periodicals spread information about abuses to win more support for their causes, and ultimately ended many abuses committed against the native populations around the world. This is not to say missionaries always did the right thing or were always perfect. There are many examples of missionaries doing harmful things to indigenous people. But overall, Protestant missionaries appear to have been a force for good. Protestants also helped to advance literacy and education, being that it was necessary to read the Bible. Protestant areas consistently printed more books per capita and exported more printed material per capita than Catholic areas. For many elites, mass printing seemed detrimental, as it would spread books to those not equipped to interpret or understand them. Protestant missionaries effectively changed this by forcing other groups to compete with how much printed material they put out. In Puritan New England, the settlers made a written alphabet in Algonquian so they could translate the Bible into that language and work to educate the American Indian population of New England, teaching them things like civil law and political theory. The abolitionist movement was largely run by Protestants who became convinced the Bible forbids slavery and organized boycotts around goods that were made using slave labor. Protestants also worked to educate local indigenous populations, unlike other groups, and dispersed power by developing and spreading new organizational forms and protest tactics. They encouraged democratic institutions, political organizing for rights, and extending equality to non-white populations. Missionaries spread SMO forms and tactics internationally. Early Protestant missionaries tried to reform what they considered abuses in other societies, e.g., foot binding, female genital cutting, widow burning, and consummating marriage before age 12. Woodbury ran a model to examine the relationship between countries that have Protestant missionary influence and countries with more democratic values and liberties. Statistically, the prevalence of Protestant missionaries explains about half the variance in democracy, giving a robust result that Protestant influence led to more democratic values and away from authoritarian ideologies. In all 5 contexts analyzed, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, European settler colonies, and mission territories, Protestantism is associated with democracy. Comparative historical analysis shows that Protestants consistently initiated and spread factors that past research suggests promote democracy: mass printing, mass education, civil society, and colonial rule of law. The cumulative correlation between Protestant missions and democracy is 0.707. Similarly, Roland to Salem ran a similar study and found the same result. Higher Protestant populations are more likely to have higher levels of voice and accountability, political stability, citizenship empowerment, and civil society pluralism. To Salem looked at the effects Protestantism, Catholicism, and Islam had on nations. It found Protestantism correlated with higher levels of personal freedom, media independence, and the promotion of basic human rights. The effect of Protestantism on the voice and accountability measure and the CIRA measure of citizenship empowerment attained statistical significance. Catholicism was also positively associated with higher levels of voice and accountability and citizenship empowerment. Islam was negatively correlated with these measures, but did fail to achieve a threshold of statistical significance. So essentially, Islam did not correlate with desirable outcomes that increased freedom and democratic values. Protestantism and Catholicism also predicted more non-governmental organizations among the populace, whereas Islam was in the non-significant range. Similar results were found for political stability. and the ability to create positive political transformation. Essentially, the data shows that around the world, Christian groups have been very influential in promoting democracy, human rights, and reducing government corruption. It does not make sense to claim Christianity leads to nationalism or authoritarianism. These ideas likely flourish when people begin to reject Christianity, not embrace it. An embrace of Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity, is likely to result in more civil liberties and democratic values. Now, some have argued Nazism was a result of Christianity. Allegedly, many high officials in the Nazi regime were Christians, and often used Christian language in their writings and speeches. So did Christianity influence and give rise to Nazism? The historian Nathan Johnstone notes this as inaccurate. Hitler was not a Bible-believing Christian that held to the core doctrines of the faith. Whatever Hitler was, he was not a practicing Christian in the ordinary sense. Historians to this day still debate about what the Nazis' religious convictions were. The problem is, what we have is a mix of various influences and conflicting rhetoric of the Nazis. It's hard to really nail down a specific religious dogma. However, it is easy for people today to take a few quotes from here or there and claim the Nazis were pure atheists, or fundamentalist Christians, or pagans. Johnstone says, the German national community could represent a return to the primordial racial paganism, a completion of the Christian Reformation, a providential fulfillment of social Darwinist law, or a combination of these and more. There is no consensus among historians on what the Nazis believed. It is likely not all the officials of the regime had the same religious beliefs. What united them was not a religious ideology, but a political and a racial one. In other words, their motives came from other ideological factors, not Christian religiosity. Their main motives stem from Nazi ideology itself. One could even argue Nazism itself was the political religion that drove the regime. It was a secular religion, where what was sacred was redirected to secular aspects, like the superiority of the Aryan race, the hatred of the Jewish people, and utter loyalty to the state and Hitler himself, who was seen as the savior of his people. The state became the savior and God. The national and racial community became the new church. Religious symbols were reinterpreted in these secular ways. Historian Klaus von Dung argues that the Nazis found their higher reality in the notion of thinking they were a superior race. With National Socialism, the center is the blood. As the substantive carrier of the blood, there is the nation. Thence follow as sacred symbols the soil, as the land upon which the nation was nourished, the Reich as the unit in which it was politically actualized, the Führer as the representative of both nation and Reich, and the flag. In other words, Nazism was, if anything, a secular religion, where secular aspects became sacred. Divorced from the traditional understandings of the sacred on religious doctrines and the divine, religious symbolism was redirected to the secular. Johnstone says, secularization then disengaged the sacralizing instinct from the institutional religions, but the uncoupling only allowed it to run free. No longer dependent on the church to confer sacrality, the state could now appear to be possessed of majestic power of itself and so become the object of direct veneration. So Nazism followed the same pattern that Roger Brubaker explained. Instead of Nazism and authoritarianism coming directly from the teachings of Christianity, it was moving away from Christian religiosity and redirecting religious symbols and aspects of the sacred towards the state. Nazism was more likely a result of far right-wing secularization, while trying to hold on to religious symbolism. It very much followed the pattern the earlier research we cited demonstrated. The erosion of religious beliefs and traditional doctrines led to secularizing and repurposing religious symbols. Nathan Johnstone also notes there is no reason to think Christendom stood by or peacefully existed with Nazism. There was clear resistance. Mark Riebling writes that Pope Pius XII actively worked to assassinate Hitler through 3 assassination attempts. Throughout his network of priests, he also fed information to the Allies to help with the downfall of the Third Reich. Many Christian leaders were actively opposed to Nazism and worked to end it. In truth, when we look at all the data, it's hard to believe that Christianity necessarily leads to extreme nationalism or authoritarianism, let alone Nazism. The more Christian and religious a population is, the less likely it is to move in this direction. Christianity seems more likely to lead to democratic values, religious freedom, and civil liberties. So if you're an atheist or a non-Christian, and you're worried about the rise of Christian nationalism and authoritarianism, encouraging more secularization might not be the best approach, which is according to the scientific and historical data. In fact, perhaps you should be encouraging more Christian religiosity and encouraging Christians to become more religious. Trying to reduce Christian religiosity might end up in creating more of what you're trying to reduce.